Hi everyone, thank you all for coming to, is it the fourth seminar of Thinking Space, and it's so good to see so many of you. It's a good number of the participants of the seminar. So today we have two speakers, Amanda Tattersall and Kurt Iverson. So Amanda is an associate professor of practice, and Kurt is a professor in geography in the School of Geosciences. They are currently writing a book called People, Power in Cities, which is what they will be going to present today, and to publish by Oxford University Press. And I also would like to inform you that this seminar is being recorded. So if anyone here or on Zoom is not willing to be recorded, maybe just raise your hand and let us know. Okay, thank you. Have the floor, Kurt and Amanda.
Great, thank you. So I just want to start by acknowledging we're meeting on Gadigal land and pay my respect to elders past, present, and to Indigenous people here, but also those Indigenous people in many of the case studies, such as Cape Town, have been part of our research. So this is the book about people, power in cities. We've been working on it for a long time. There's a lot of good thinking behind this, but it's accelerating towards being submitted very soon. So we're really delighted to be able to bring some of those, to be like a quick overview of what is 5 years of research. But to start, we want to take you to Hong Kong. So we're on the 14th of July 2019. You might remember the Hong Kong protests around the extradition bill. This is in Shin Tin, which is in the New Territories, in the regional area in Hong Kong. And I'm there with, 140,000 people. This is the fifth weekly protest in a row. In June, there were 2 million person marches on Hong Kong Island against the extradition bill and 4 demands around universal suffrage. And then the protests was staged. I went to those protests there. It was an incredible form of mobilising people power, one of the 5 forms of people power that we're going to talk about today. And it was incredibly internally creative. You might remember that there were different forms of protests that happened in Hong Kong. There were mass peaceful marches organised by the Peacefuls, the Civil Human Rights Front, and that's where this was one of those protests. But within that movement, there were the militants, a younger, more agitational faction within the movement who sought to confront police violence with a strong defence. They had a uniform, they wore masks. This was for facial recognition, but they often wore full-face gas masks to avoid tear gas. They used garbage bin lids to stop rubber bullets. They used orange cones, witches' hats, to put out tear gas, and that so they could hold the streets in a more aggressive way than they would have if they were unsupported by that uniform. And there was a tactical coordination that often was unnoticed by the press, but was actively organised digitally as well as face-to-face between those two movements that had historic. It's a historic strategy based in the sort of weaknesses of the umbrella movement that had happened in 2014. So, it's an example of mobilising both of its extraordinary power, but also a reminder that people power has limits, just like anything. We know that in May 2020, after COVID, the Beijing authorities took power in Hong Kong and basically crushed the two systems and independent rule of law. So people power is strong, but people power also has its limits.
Yeah. And so, sometimes these struggles over people's rights to the city take that kind of spectacular and very intense form, with hundreds of thousands, even millions involved. But sometimes, of course, they're much more everyday and prosaic and less spectacular. So if we rewind back to 2016 in Hong Kong, I was also there at that time doing some research on another project, in fact, walking up and down the corridors of this building on the left, the Chongqing Mansions in the Mong Kok area of the city. And I was there primarily to talk to the migrant traders who play a really vital role in the global circulation of secondhand mobile phones between the global north and the global south. So while I was there, everybody had kept telling me, once you've finished your interviews, you've got to pop up a few more levels and get the biryani at the Pakistani restaurants on the 5th and 6th floors. So I went up there and in one of the corridors, kind of like the one that you can see there in the top in the middle. There was a group of Pakistani kids having a game of cricket. They apologised for nearly hitting me. I said, no worries. They said, are you Australian? I said, yep. And next thing you know, there was a test match going on in the corridors of Chongqing. So a few weeks later, I was attending an event organised by an alliance in Hong Kong called Hong Kong Citizens, a bit like the Sydney Alliance that Amanda established here and that I've been involved in. It's a coalition of faith and community groups working together in the city. Their model of organising is to engage in a really slow process of relationship building across diverse organisations and communities, followed by a period of figuring out what we've all got in common and then taking action on those common issues. Now, in 2016, one of their actions was to invite all the candidates in the upcoming district council elections, both the pro-Democrats and the pro-Beijing camps, to a forum in a local church where all of those candidates were asked to respond to a citizen platform for the district. And at that event, another group of Pakistani young people were actually there because they had negotiated with this entire alliance to put the issue of cricket pitches on the agenda of the common good of the district council in Sham Shui Po. They were policed out of parks and forced to play their cricket in places like corridors in the Chongqing mansions. The lack of facilities and that experience in public space really negatively impacted their sense of belonging and home. But they weren't protesting, they weren't in the streets, they were in a local church trying to build relationships with decision makers who could make a difference in their lives on that particular issue, in coalition with others in the city from diverse backgrounds. So it's a whole different mode of making change. And I guess those sort of stories set the scene and hopefully illustrate that the way that people in cities pursue their rights to the city can take a whole range of forms. And the research that we've been doing over the last few years, and that the Henry Halloran Trust has very generously supported, we should acknowledge, is all about thinking about the choices that movements are making in trying to change their cities. And as people who've been involved in trying to do a little bit of that here in Sydney, when we started hitting some roadblocks in the Sydney Alliance and in community organising here, separately and together, we were hitting books to see who might have been researching and writing about the pros and cons of different strategies for making change in cities, who was grappling with these challenges of translating things across places. And to be honest, we didn't find as much cool stuff as we'd hoped to find. The Right to the City literature is super awesome, but it tends to be much better on identifying what's wrong and the injustices in cities than in thinking about how people might make things right. If you've read Rebel Cities by David Harvey, you'll see it's a fantastic account of many of the things that are wrong with our cities today, but a couple of pages there saying revolution, comrades, without really being very helpful if you're trying to do the revolution per se. So we're really trying to shift from the what to the how, and also trying to shift to the extent that, like, there's obviously a great literature out there about social movements too, but a lot of it is often quite structural. Identifying the kind of structural opportunities and the political opportunity structures in a city without really thinking about agency as much and thinking about strategic choices that movements are making. And even then, when there's a focus on what choices movements are making, often a focus on the visible things that you can see in the streets, like the Hong Kong protests, and less about really the kind of deeper political imaginaries and concepts that maybe are informing the choices that folks make. So I guess that pushed us into wanting to do some work on what we've come to call urban people power strategy, which is just to ask some very broad questions about how social movements understand and build and enact people's collective capacity to shape their city.
Great. So how did we do this research? Well, we brought a few different approaches to the table. First, as Kurt's mentioned, we have relevant lived experience as researchers. You know, I've spent 15 years building different forms of urban movements in Sydney. Kurt has also participated in the Sydney Alliance. We have lived and experienced that side of this kind of research, you know, called autoethnography or militant ethnography. We've been able to use that experience to uncover key questions and identify issues that we think are important to investigate, both for a research perspective, but also to make sure that research has a practitioner relevance. Secondly, we did an extensive mapping process. So we've identified more than 950 examples of urban people power across the world in every inhabited continent. It's not sought to be extensive. we're certain there's quite a lot more urban people power than what we've found, but we've sought to sort of to map the extent, to be able to see different variations and forms, translations and networking between different forms of people power and between different cities, how strategies travel and are exchanged. We did 5 case studies, which I'm going to refer through when we go through the forms of people power in Austin, Cape Town, Hong Kong, Sydney and Barcelona. And then what we did was we co-designed our data analysis. So after 3 years of doing some initial field work, we brought 30 leaders from each of our case studies and some additional cities to a gathering, a global gathering that was supported by the Sydney Policy Lab. And for a week, we sat with those activists, digesting our reflections, then feeding off we wrote a book for them about the research, and we unpacked the research. And it was that process of talking with the leaders who are part of our network was instrumental for sort of allowing us to finally come across this framework about 5 people power strategies.
And so the framework that we're about to try and bust out and test out on you started just by like a fairly, obvious and simple set of questions to ask the movements that we were working with, which is about what are the key kind of dilemmas that they face in trying to change their cities. Just based on the idea that if we're interested in the strategies they develop, we want to understand their analysis of the challenges to which their strategies are responding. And of course, there are a gazillion dilemmas for anybody trying to change their city, but 6 dilemmas kept coming back to us in so many of the interviews that we've done with people. So there's a set of like who questions that everybody's grappling with. So if you're trying to change your city, who do you need in your movement? Who do you need to be in coalition with? And what does participation and or representation look like for the participants? So you might have an alliance that seeks to speak for the whole city. In Jakarta, as we were hearing about last week in the Urban Crew, we've got urban poor consortiums talking about the urban poor majority in their city. We've got occupied movements of the disaffected, and again, they're people participating in an Occupy movement, say, are participating as individuals, whereas in the Urban Poor Consortium and in the Sydney Alliance, people are participating through their organisations. So there's no perfect way to organise who is involved and how they're involved, of course, and that's precisely because in the sort of urban context of super diversity, there's no unified or sovereign people that you're trying to assemble here. You're actually trying to make unity and collectivity in the process of doing the work. So there's, of course, the question about issues, the what question, if you like, which is about the choice of issues that you decide to take on, the concrete changes that you want to make with respect to those issues to try and make your city better and how you choose. And of course, that's partly about what people are going through, whether the pressures are around housing or policing or transport, but it's also about assessments for people about what's winnable, what's going to be transformative, what's going to make a lasting difference, et cetera, et cetera. There's resourcing questions that really sit under the hood that so rarely get written about in the social movement literature, but like all this stuff takes money and resources to make it happen. So how do you fund and sustain your work? Choices between state and philanthropic funding, membership dues, sweat equity, voluntary time and commitment, all these choices are being made with different consequences by different organisers. What's the spatial scale that you're going to try and organise your city in? What are you going to try and do the whole city? Are you going to try and do part of the city? Are you going to try and have an assembly of different parts? How do you organise yourselves there to facilitate a balance between coordination across space in your city and autonomy for local actors to be addressing particular pressure points? And what connections do you make beyond your city, given that, of course, anything that's going on in your city is not confined to it, but many times the processes that you're trying to change stretch across space. Spatial scale is also the temporal scale or the tempo of your organising, like how fast or slowly do you need to move? What's the urgency or not of the issues that you're working on? Do you need to get a quick no to happen straight away, or are you trying to build a sustained campaign to a kind of yes? And of course, then there's questions about how these movements interact with governance, which in cities is both multi-scalar. Sydney's a great example, local, metropolitan, state, national governments, and multidimensional in the sense that governments and states are only one kind of authority in a city, and there are many others that you will be dealing with. So in response to all those dilemmas, at least 5 patterns of people power strategies seem to have emerged.
Which seek to take on these dilemmas in particular ways. So this is the quick run through of this, because we've attached a case study to each of these forms of people power. So very briefly, the first, playing by the rules. So this is where urban actors seek to participate in the formal channels of the state, often the Liberal Democratic state, using the rules to be able to advance their cause. They might be in consultative processes, they might be voting, they might be using the court system. These rules very much play to questions of time, timelines of elections, and core processes and consultations are set by others, set by the state, not by those making the change, and they structure how participation is enabled. The strength of this form of engagement is that it's legitimate, right? People are seen as doing the appropriate form of influencing when they're acting like this, and often people play by the rules to get sort of social license for more forms of escalatory action down the track. The weakness of playing by the rules is that someone else wrote the rules, and they often constrain the capacity to take action. So we often see that people need to resort to other forms of people power. Our case study in Austin, that's Austin, was a protracted example of 10 years of fighting over zoning rules. And it's not a case study where it's just like tick a box success. It's still in the middle of a vexed conversation around rules using courts and processes and planning, consultation, and you name it, between old residents and new urbanists who are stuck in a process of not being able to unwind or disaggregate a pattern of being able to work together using the limits. It sort of shows the limits of playing by the rules as much as anything else. Second, mobilising. See, there's the uniform. It's where we turn out people for visible forms of protest and demonstration, where power is demonstrated quantitatively in numbers. The bigger the protest, the more media it gets, the more power it's seen to have. The power of this form of people power is that it's fast, it's very effective when it can be done reactively, and often that is also very powerful when it's saying no. It's easy to form a mobilising coalition against something, and it's very effective in that context. But its challenge is it's not so easy to form a massive mobilisation around a yes proposition, and it can be harder to present solutions using this kind of strategy. Hong Kong exhibits this. Interestingly, they did have a yes component to the Hong Kong strategy. There was a yes component around universal suffrage, but it still struggled to be able to advance that strategy using mobilising alone. Third, organising. So organising is traditionally understood as a practice that was developed by a guy called Saul Alinsky in Chicago and spread around the world. We define it more broadly than that, though, because it's commonplace in lots of places as a way of forming social change that has a couple of attributes. One, that's focused on relationships between different constituencies, creation of those sort of diverse relationships, and two, where the practice of people power seeks to engage and promote leadership amongst those diverse constituencies. So that does happen in groups like the Sydney Alliance, and they're part of formal community organising networks, but it also happens in places like Barcelona with the La Paz housing campaign, where they did extensive leadership development amongst people who had been subject to eviction. Its strength is that this strategy does seem capable of being able to promote proactive solutions, like they can bring people together, negotiate and identify a proactive agenda for change. Its challenge is that it's really slow. It can be hard to resource, and sometimes it can suffer from a lowest common denominator agenda if people aren't able to compromise on a clear mutual interest. Fourth, nearly there, prefiguring. So prefiguring is, it's traditionally rooted in anarchist ideas or autonomous ideological ideas of the idea of acting separate from the state, envisaging and creating, prefiguring the world as it should be in your daily practice of social change, acting as if the world you want was here. It's the power of example. It is capable of making both material change and advancing a narrative by actually doing that change in real time. Its challenge is that it's a high barrier action. It's hard to actually enact change, enact the world as it should be in the world as it is. Reclaim the city. This is us in Cape Town. Did this by occupying a bunch of state-owned land and creating emergency housing in the inner city of Cape Town, showing that you can build black housing in white Cape Town. They were able to do that through the power of example. And fifth, running for office. urban people power systems, municipalism. This is the power of forming independent parties and platforms to contest elections. That's the power of governing to enact change. Parties create a broad agenda. They are often able to obtain resources from the state if elected, even if they don't win control of government. So there's a very heightened tension between the pressures that come from being elected and then in government from the movements that you represent. You've seen this in Barcelona, which is our case study, Barcelona en Comú, where Barcelona en Comú is an activist party led by housing activists in the La Paz movement. They get elected and they're all of a sudden responsible for a majority-based set of decision makers with a jurisdictional power that's not endless and restricted by other levels of government, and they aren't able to fulfil the ambitious housing policies that they wanted to do. So seeing how those tensions play out in practice is part of the exploration of that.
Right. And so look, I mean, across, like you can sort of see those 5 strategies are kind of the core of the book and they're worked through in these chapters and case studies. But obviously we're sort of interested in trying to reflect across them as well. And so to make a couple of sort of fairly obvious geographical points, when you're comparing places as diverse as the places in our case studies and beyond, we're absolutely, of course, not saying that all cities are the same and that, you know, all 5 of these things are present in the same way in different places. But I guess we are, I think, making a kind of claim about the diversity of people power strategies being not completely random and being patterned in some way, precisely in some of the senses that we've just talked about. And I guess looking across those 5 different strategies in cities, it's like thinking about how they coexist within a city and even sometimes within organisations has been one of the really interesting things across all of those 5 case studies. And again, to dip into personal experience here for a moment, even just our own union folks thinking about the different arguments about strategy that we have in a union, let alone in a broader urban movement. You know, there's not agreement on everybody saying this is how we work and this is how we're going to work together. And so Rodrigo Nunez there actually talks about movement ecologies existing in a city that are kind of like a mix of collective intention where people are making agreements about how to work, but those collectives are also aggregated in a way that is not always coordinated or even cooperative in a city. And so thinking about how these 5 things aren't like separate, but often are intertwined and relations intention has been really interesting in understanding that ecological plurality, as he would put it. And of course, the other obvious geographical point to make is that precisely the patterning happens through inter-urban exchanges and diffusion. These different strategies are moving across urban contexts through a whole bunch of formal and informal channels of learning, sometimes literally because people are seeing what they've done in Hong Kong to beat tear gas and seeing it on television, and then suddenly it's popping up in 6 or 7 other cities within a couple of months. Sometimes it's happening because people are moving between cities and even explicitly like formal training relationships that exist between movements across spaces. And it's, I guess, that question of inter-urban diffusion and networking. That's also a process of translation when you're inspired or learning from another place. Like, how do you translate it to work in your context, given that it's going to be different? That's also something that has kept coming up across all those case studies. And actually, we'll give a bit of an example of that exact issue right now.
So in Cape Town, and so this is a picture. I was in Barcelona and went to this welcome assembly in Barcelona. A year later, I was at an advice assembly in Cape Town, and they are adaptation and translation of the same strategy. So in the context of a very interesting case study in Cape Town, where they first tried playing by the rules to legally allow for the creation of affordable housing in the inner city by getting parcels of land. And then they protested around that using mobilising, and both of those strategies didn't work. Then they occupied a whole bunch of buildings and built emergency housing, which was good, but even that was still challenged because they were having massive levels of eviction in the city, and Little Reclaim the City was unable to individually provide grievances and legal advice to all the people who were facing eviction. They were in a space where they were really open to even more new ideas to be able to respond to the challenges they were in. In May, 2017, by chance, someone from LAPA from Barcelona was in Cape Town and gave a talk, and 6 of the leaders from the Cape Town Reclaim the City group went to that talk, and he was talking about these advice assemblies and all the interesting housing work that was being done in Barcelona. The organisers were fascinated, had several meetings with him, raised money from the Ford Foundation, took a trip to Barcelona and attended the first Fearless Cities conference that was held in June 2017. June 2017, it was sponsored by Barcelona on Canoe. At that trip, like I did, they went to a meeting of the Welcome Assembly in Barcelona. The Advice Assembly is what it looks like organising. They don't use the phrase community organising particularly, but it's where people who have been evicted get up and they share their story about what they're going through, and then people who've previously confronted eviction get up and share strategies about what they did to confront their own eviction. And the process is one that is politicising and collectivising of information, decentralising expertise and allowing the group to sort of coach and educate itself. It allows people to see that their personal experience of eviction isn't one just of personal failure and shame, that it's something that's experienced by the community, and then the community steps in to help solve the problem. It is a process of sort of political formation and leadership development. When the organisers went to that meeting, the lead organiser, Colin Cossa, said to me, he said, we knew immediately that that's exactly what we needed to do in Cape Town. So the group of organisers that went to that thing went back to Cape Town and then had to translate the strategy. And what we found was that that process of translation was a lot harder than just being informed about a new idea. First, one of the key things they did that was successful was they called it an advice assembly. They renamed it. And that was based on drawing in symbolic, historical, cultural imaginaries from Cape Town into this strategy. Advice officers were anti-apartheid organisers who would support people in the informal settlements during apartheid. And so calling them advice assemblies sought to link into that local history while translating this global strategy. And the second thing is that sometimes with organising, when we found that the more complex the practices that are involved in a form of people power, the harder it is to travel. So it needs more relational and more mentoring support for difficult things to travel. When something is sort of fairly visible and standard, like when there's tear gas, use orange cones, it can travel very fast, very easily, just through digital channels. It doesn't necessarily need personal ones. But when something has complexity, like what Malucci would call, when it's myopic, when it's hard to actually see the details under the surface, personal relationships are key. But they didn't have deep personal relationships with LAPA. And what it meant was they spent 18 months trialling and testing 4 forms of iteration to try and get this strategy right. And so it was through trialling and testing. The process of trialling and testing basically was one of allowing them to sort of disorganise some of their playing by the rules and mobilising practices, which both were based on a culture of doing for others, lawyers coming and doing sort of client services or mobilising just staff, teaching people about popular education, to create space for this organising culture, which was much more focused on people leading themselves or staff getting out of the way, and people being able to create a culture of collective knowledge where everyone is an expert rather than just employed staff. But after 18 months, they were able to do that. They were able to land the strategy, and the advice assembly still continue in Cape Town.
And like just a tiny little addition, but like that even way of organising, it's interesting even now watching how it's diffusing across Barcelona into a set of different issues as well. So there's a whole bunch of people also now experiencing like energy and water disconnections in the city, and it's taken longer for the idea around this kind of organising support to move from housing into energy than it took for it to move from housing in Barcelona to housing in Cape Town. The channels of diffusion and translation are super interesting. But so look, I guess we're at that point in the book writing that I remember Sophie presenting on her work relatively recently and being like, oh shit, the conclusion, right? You get to that point. So we're kind of working on that, and I guess thinking towards what are the things that we want to say from all of this work. And the first point that sort of try and make in a way is that like we've been slowly testing out this idea around strategic choices and people power strategies, and the 5 that we've identified in some publications and in some talks, and hoping that that in itself is a contribution, right? Like both the idea that there are nameable strategies out there that, you know, change as they move, but are nameable and understandable and have different strengths and weaknesses in different contexts is in itself hopefully a contribution that is useful for both more scholarship in this area, which may well find other patterns that we haven't identified, and also, of course, for practitioner and movement folks. This question around the interaction between strategies and the tensions between them within a kind of plural ecology is also emerging as a really interesting, not just observation, but finding. And I guess like Hong Kong and Barcelona of our two case studies are the most extraordinary for seeing people who in other places would hate each other's guts and never want to work together because they have picked a lane, they know what's best, actually figuring out that like all of us staying in our separate lanes is not going to help us. So just to give you one example from Barcelona, Amanda's already given you one from Hong Kong. Like literally there, the people who are in the autonomous squatting movement are working collaboratively with the people who ran for office in the state, forging what they are calling public commons partnerships as an alternative to public-private partnerships in how we distribute resources in the city. So again, a prefigurative strategy and an electoral strategy, which in some ways are at the opposite ends of some ideological spectrums, actually figuring out how to cooperate. And it's amazing to watch that process in action. And so the other thing that I guess still we're trying to find the right language to talk about is precisely that sometimes when we're presenting this work, it's like we end up in conversations about the actions rather than the strategy, if that makes sense. So like mobilizing and organizing and even playing by the rules can make use of a protest as an action. But what an organizer is doing when they're protesting compared to a mobilizer, compared to a et cetera, is different. So, you know, some actions are portable across strategies and will reappear in different strategic boxes as we're sort of putting them. And so that does, again, it's, I guess, trying to articulate that is one thing that we're still really working on. But I guess to finish, hopefully, yeah, like this project is really, I won't read this quote from Rodrigo Núñez word for word, but this book, neither horizontal nor vertical, that he offers as a political scientist as what he calls a theory of organization. I guess we're sort of seeing ourselves in a similar space to that work. And I'm really enjoying the language, as you can hear, that he's deploying in some of that work. Particularly the idea that, like, by specifying the variables that are involved in the problem of, you know, doing people power, of mapping the choices, the trade-offs and the thresholds, the question of organisation, he's sort of saying, ceases to be one where you pick a lane and make a case for it, and becomes instead this lovely idea of a sort of shared work site in which many of us are engaged, trying not to just make a case for the one true way and the silver bullet for social change, but trying to understand the complexity and the patterns that are being used to try and do that work in different urban contexts. So we wanted to leave plenty of time for conversation and questions. We're done. Thank you.
Anybody has any questions in the room?
Thanks so much, Kurt and Amanda. It was great. It made me think, you know, obviously a lot about systems, land care and lock the gate in particular, which I know you've done a lot on. And I was just wondering, you know, when you talk about that messiness around three different things, I suppose, I was wondering if you could comment on, like, one, infiltration and co-opting movements and strategies that movements use to, you know, deal with that. Yeah. Two, like split-offs. Like, is that a strategy to then split off or create working groups, or how do different groups deal with that? And the third one is around when there's that quick mobilisation around a specific issue, and then that issue kind of seems to have been dealt with, and then that movement, how do you keep it on simmer, I suppose, until, you know, you don't want it to completely disintegrate? How do you keep people on simmer, I suppose? Yeah.
Thanks for that answer.
Is that Amanda? All three, go.
It's such good points, and I haven't actually got neat answers for them. I would say just that I guess what we're seeing or making the case for is that there is no silver bullet strategy when it comes to making change, and so therefore there's always the capacity for a rich interconnection and use of different ways to make change. So whereas maybe if if you had some sort of an attitude that organising was the best way, split-offs would be seen as negative. Whereas from this perspective, I sort of feel like split-offs are potentially very healthy and productive. So you could say that La Paz split off and helped to create the Indignados protest movements in 2011, and then it split off again and created Barcelona en Comú. But actually, the other way you could look at it is that the movement ecosystem grew and evolved to create different forms of change. And it wasn't like in Cape Town, there was a little bit of we tried this, it didn't work, then we added this. And it's not like it's shifting from one thing to another thing, but more just making that space the strategic space more complex, especially when the challenges that you're facing are particularly complex. The infiltration question makes me think about Hong Kong, but I don't have a neat answer to that one. And I guess with the simmer, there's a lot of classic literature about mobilising and organising as partners, right? So you mobilise you organise to create the base, then you mobilise people into the heat of the action, and then you organise to pick them up again. And I think there's a true dynamic to that. I guess so Harry Hine writes on that, Jay McAlevey. I guess what we're saying is that dynamic is true, but it's also more complex than that. There are prefigurative strategies, party strategies. There's more going on than just that sort of heat and then gather. You see lots of interesting dynamics in sitting there.
But just as one tiny example of that, so the running for office strategy, for instance, has been used in quite a few cases to try and do exactly what you're talking about keep things on a simmer. And it's running for office not to win office, but to get an office where you've got a staff and you can then have a sort of cadre of movement people who are suddenly now in full-time employment doing political work that helps keep things chugging along after, so we've definitely, that thing about the tempos and the shifting tempos is something that keeps coming up.
Yeah, the infiltration one, I was definitely thinking about Hong Kong and how that can turn people off the movement, radical elements taking over. Those ins and outs.
And also that idea of infiltration, you sort of have to land it in the city, right? Locate it in a particular city, because you can't understand how they were able to cope with the massive level of tension between a bunch of people basically fighting the cops and a bunch of people doing public protests and then deciding to not attack each other. Can't be understood unless you go back to Umbrella in 2014, where they were at each other's throats, and it killed the movement, and it sent waves of pain through sort of the ecosystem. People were arrested and detained and jailed as a consequence of this sort of division that happened within civil society. And so when this second movement happened, there was a commitment to do something differently, and they stuck by it. They stuck by it with a level of discipline that I've never seen in a global north environment, to be honest. It was quite extraordinary, their willingness to allow multiple strategies to coexist.
So we've had, I'm pretty sure I've asked you about this at least every time you presented on some part of the.
Maybe we'll have a better answer this time. Let's go.
Maybe. It's really striking to me in this presentation that the issues with which they're confronting in cities, the what, plays almost no part in what you're talking about. So I'm just wondering, but while the context of the city seems to be important, right? The kind of historical antecedents to organising, or the specific physical geography of the city, which enables particular kinds of strategies over others. So the kind of context of the city really matters, but the kinds of claims they're making or changes they're seeking don't seem to play out at all. And surely there has to be surely it has to matter a little bit.
The whole Barcelona Cape Town thing was about housing. I guess they're all, so you're right, all of these case studies are not about abstract people organising their cities for the sake of it, there are specific things. Each of the case studies, in other words, has Sydney, how are we going to make renewable energy accessible to migrant non-English speaking communities? Cape Town, how are we going to actually find affordable housing for Black people in the city centre who are working there, et cetera, right? So, so all of them do have that. And it's kind of as that question is obviously primary in terms of the strategic dilemmas that then the strategies are responding to. And I guess, I mean, what we still don't have, I think, and I don't know about you, like we could talk about this more. I don't think I'd want to, is the idea that there are particular strategies that are best fit for any given issue. Like, I think that is kind of, I wouldn't want to go there because that would be just way too big a claim to be making. But at least what we can do is reflect on this strategy deployed in response to that particular challenge. And these are the successes and not successes that it had.
So I'm not trying to suggest that you guys don't think that the issues matter, because obviously they do. You're not interested in, I mean, but it's more like how those issues matter for the framework, I suppose. So like it's an the idea that you said that this anti-eviction method of the welcome assemblies, is that what the assemblies, that travels in housing seems more easily than it does into other kinds of protests. So I think that kind of makes a difference for.
I guess my sort of 2 cents on it is, I think that the academic literature on social movements reifies the issues almost to the exclusion of strategy, and we're trying to invert that.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we're not saying issues don't matter. We're just saying that issues have created a sort of this myopic way of ignoring how people are coming at contesting the issues that we think is equally important and needs attention. One. And I guess the second thing is that by looking at strategies and comparing across different issues, we're able to identify, feels like we're able to identify a sort of an aggregation of urban contestation that isn't limited to a specific issue. Like, we actually have written a book about housing strategies across the world and done that sort of line of thinking through a specific issue in 4 case studies. And I think you can do it.
It was an article, that wasn't a book.
Article, sorry.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
And I think the framework can apply to an issue for sure, right? There's a particular sort of, but I think it doesn't need to, I guess is what we're saying. And I have enjoyed being able to go, wow, what's happening in a democracy movement in Hong Kong can speak to and give insights to what's happening in a housing movement in Barcelona, what's happening to a climate movement in Sydney, and that we can learn there are aggregatable lessons across them. I think for me, it's about what to focus on. And this stuff is less focused on and needs more attention for being able to understand what success looks like in cities.
Cool. Other people might have been first. Anyway, thank you. It was really interesting to talk, get the idea that 5 strategies and exemplars in terms of cities regards the issues in some ways. But how would you define success in terms of these strategies? Like, is it what the people themselves wanted? Is there some desired outcome? Is it because it works in a particular area? Where do you go apart from saying these are different strategies that were used in particular cities?
That's a really good question. Like, I would say that loosely there are 2 broad areas of what success looks like. And I think that the point is that we're saying each of the forms of people power achieve different forms of success. And so partly it's about what kinds of success movements are wanting means how they engage with the strategies. But broadly, success can be defined in terms of forms of social change, which is both winning specific policy change as well as shifting a political climate in an urban context. The climate is more interested in working on housing than it was before, like in Barcelona. And then democratic capacity building strategies, such as the capacity to relate to other movements and organisations and forms of change, and the development of people who do that contestation, right? So it's the democracy piece, building the capacity for collective action ongoing, building change in the city. But that is each of the strategies are better at different things. Organising is great at democratic capacity building, but can struggle to do some of the policy win work. Mobilising is excellent at policy win work when it's saying no to something, but is much more trouble when it's advancing a new policy, right? Like, they all have different strengths and weaknesses across a sort of broad success framework.
Yeah, great. I love this. I can't wait to read the book. I'm thinking about parallels to a literature I know much better on kind of labour agency and the question of what counts as people power. Like, a direction of travel in the labour agency literature over the last decade has been to find more and more examples of labour agency everywhere, right? At the very micro scales, moving down from big stuff to kind of coping strategies, what Katz would call resilience, going from the collective to look at the individual. It's just been about trying to push the definition of what agency is, kind of uncovering it everywhere, in the cracks everywhere. I'm just wondering if there's an analogue here, or does people power necessarily have to be transformative at the urban scale and collective? Or does some of that other stuff, which people who draw attention to it would say could be generative over time of more collective forms, is that still in your radar, or does that just not count as people power? That kind of individual resilience stuff?
I think it's a really good question. Like, what's the boundary that we're drawing here? Like, how wide is the public space? Because in a sense, there's a sense of drawing a fairly wide boundary, but I tell you what, those occupations that, with the personal is political, there's a lot of, and even the idea of engaging people's personal experience around eviction, which can be very private and shaming, into a public, public and politicised character. I think there is a sense at which there's some loose line around public action, but I think that we're interested in pushing it more open. Like the prefigurative work was that we didn't come into this thinking about prefiguration. We found it in Cape Town, and then at the global gathering, one of the academics from the UK was there and said, "Oh, what you're talking about, that's prefiguration." And then we went on this journey around sort of discovering it, and in doing so, we didn't have this framework of 5 people, we had 3. And it all changed through that process. So I think that's a great question for us to take on board.
Yeah, I would have thought that there's a thing about like all of the case studies and some of the early writing we did out of the research was really about stuff that was speaking to a kind of horizon of the whole city, right? That's the imagination and the imaginary horizon of the things that people are doing, which can be as small as 300 people in a church in a district, but their imaginary is that this is something that's not just about our patch, but it's actually trying to scale up in some way to the whole city. But like, yeah, I mean, I've been talking with one of the local resident groups about a talk on this that would be pitched to them, and he's literally just saying, I mean, we could have a example like people trying to get a pedestrian crossing in their neighbourhood, right? And like, you could go paint it on, prefigurative, you could have a protest down at the local MP's office, you could try and get the churches and the schools together and build some lasting relationships out of your campaign about it. Like, so in some sense, I'm hoping it might be portable to things that are getting down to a more micro scale even that you were talking about. But like, yeah, it'll be fun to talk more about, as you say, if there's those exact debates happening in the labour agency literature, then we can surely learn a bit from that as we're writing it all up. So, yeah.
I'm fascinated by how you structure the writing, because I mean you've got these 5 strategies, but are you jumping backwards and forwards between your case studies where the context is really important? So do you start out by explaining the context of what's happening in each of your case studies and then jumping backwards and forwards to the strategies, or do you start out with the strategies and then just go a little bit piecemeal into the case studies? It seems to me there's a real dilemma in writing that, or maybe that's why you're still doing it.
No. And so it feels like, again, you say, but it feels there's a bit of a, in my head anyway, a bit of a like Manuel Castellsi thing where it's kind of like, all right, early chapters, we're just going to bust out these 5 things saying this is where we got to by the end of it all. And now let us take you into some case studies of how they've worked. And then, as you say, bringing the context, the issues and all the things that are particular to it into it. So there's a little bit of both. And like, it's like you say, and even just in seeing the questions that we're getting on the talk, it's kind of the first time, well, one of the first times we've just tried to present what would effectively be chapter 2 before getting into the details. And I guess that's the strategy, right?
Yep. It's going to be great. Simple.
Yeah. So rather than,
Well, in a sense, we have developed a framework. People are going to, it's funny, it depends on which journals you want to publish in, depends on how it sits with people. Some people like it and some people less like it. But, you know, but I feel like we've got to just own it, you know what I mean? Like, we're making this claim, we're kind of doing it gently, and we're going to sort of set it out. And then every one of the case studies, we talk about multiple groups doing multiple different strategies together, separately, over time. I guess the case studies blur what is, here's a sort of frame, and then here's it blurred in reality, both exchanges between cities and also interchanges in cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other writing challenge that is keeping me up at night, and it's just, like Amanda said, we just got to own it. But like, I still feel super uncomfortable writing about Barcelona because there are people who are there who have been working there for 30 years who, like, when I go and talk to them, they're like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Did you know about this thing that happened in 1981 that was really important to that thing that you talked about? It's like, oh shit. So, you know, I think again, making a punt and trying to do so modestly that doing some breadth here is helpful, in a way that also people doing depth is helpful, and, you know, not trying to set ourselves up as being the experts now on Barcelona or anything of the sort, but just saying that, yeah, there's some utility and value in bringing these things into dialogue, and we've tested our stuff out with the movements that we're working with and with some academics in those places, and hopefully that's useful to somebody. Yeah.
So Kurt, you'll have to write about Hornsby. And not about
totally. Yeah. I tried that. Never came out anywhere, but I know.
Everything you've talked about is sort of very broadly progressive policies and practices. But what about those people who want to retain the city and organise against certain changes? I mean, loosely NIMBY groups and so on and so forth. What are their practices, their policies?
That's the Austin case study. The Austin case study is two different narrowly interested constituencies resisting change in different ways. And one is a group of white boomers who have big houses in a city that's got really expensive property prices, and people can't get in, and there needs to be more housing for new people to be able to come in, and they're very well organised, and they kind of have been progressive, but actually their housing approach is NIMBY and restrictive. But then they're being contested by sort of flash tech money, which is landing in Austin as well, who are also claiming to be progressive, but also not necessarily being beautifully enlightened. They want to create expensive housing because they've got money. And then you've got a black community that's being gentrified. It's like that case study in particular, I think, explores some, like in many of the other places, there's brave hearts, you know what I mean? There's sort of these great social change warriors. The Austin case study, and it's just this, except the Sydney case study, more more everyday forms of activism. And I think what we learned there is that if people can't operationalise forms of people power that allow them to work with other forms of people power and build coalitions and create compromise, no matter how virtuous or whatever or terrible they get stuck. The change forms of gridlock. That's what we found.
Amanda, you just mentioned the brave hearts. I was going to ask a question earlier about what's striking about your presentation, I thought today, was it's all about structure but not much agency. And particularly in that field, I think charismatic agency is a sort of a key dynamic, both in the successive movements, but the choices of strategy, I think. So I'm just wondering how you might conceive charismatic agency.
Well, that's such a good question too. These are all great questions. I mean, and so again, I mean, if we just think about the running for office thing as probably the most obvious case of that, but like they never would have even thought to try it, let alone have success with it, if they hadn't had Ada Colau, who just is unbelievable as a political operator. Like, so
it's obviously not just structural agency; it's combinations of both.
Yeah.
I think they're both
and I guess you're right that the account that we've given needs to actually emphasise that.
We do. Yeah. We probably haven't presented it as clearly in this, because actually all the diffusion, most of the strategy diffusion is relational, which means it relies on people. Some of them are classic charismatic figures, and others are people who've been formed and learnt through struggle, but definitely there are people who carry these strategies between places or between movements in a city.
Eunice had to leave because she's teaching, so I'm back to being facilitator. Any more questions or any more suggestions? I think we could probably go on for a while. We don't have time. So any other questions now?
The peril of giving a short presentation. You get lots of.
Oh, that's what we want.
Exactly.
This is a good time to
Yeah.
get feedback.
I
The whole thing is the ink isn't finished yet, you know, it's a good time to get.
know, it's like half a dozen super awesome things for us actually, so thanks everybody. It's really helpful.
Thanks a lot. That was good.
Very helpful.
It makes me realise just how difficult a task I'm struck by how difficult it is. It must be.
Setting up, also how the structure you use for writing is like models the argument you're trying to make, like if we're saying everything's dynamic and fluid and things in boxes, we you know what I mean, we've got to hold that.
Yeah, yeah.
You're going to go back to some of your whatever.
We have been.
The reviewing. That might be the only way around some of that.
Yeah, no, so we have been,
We
yeah.
have been, like,
That's a big job.
Like, not everybody has to read everything, is the thing, you know what I mean? Like, there's some people who very generously agree to read everything, and then a bunch of people who are like, they can, I'm the Hong Kong person, send it to me, or, yeah, whatever, so, yeah.
I must say it's a great project.
oh, it's pretty,
I find another one.
Yeah. You know it's a bad article.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, we're going.
All this universal.
Oh, that's because we just had graduate
You
stuff.
just can't do it from a case study. There's no point trying to do it. But it's amazing how you're not trying to generalise, you're trying to someone else might find it.
Yeah.
And you say that 20 times and people still see. There's more reference here, or there's a lot of here, there's the case, the problem with case studies. Anyhow, good.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much for organising, Bob.
really,
She's done most of the work this semester. She's done almost everything this semester.
Well, this is unusual. Yeah.